In the dying light of the 31st of October, 1917, 800 Australian horsemen crested a ridge in the Palestinian desert and looked down a long, open slope toward a town defended by machine guns, artillery, and an army that had never expected them to be there. Their horses had been without water for nearly 60 hours. Their bayonets had been sharpened 4 days earlier, specifically for this moment. They had no cavalry sabers because they were not cavalry. They were mounted infantry, armed with rifles slung across their backs and long steel bayonets held in their fists like swords, about to attempt something that every military textbook written in the previous 50 years said was no longer possible. Ask yourself this: had you heard of the Charge of Beersheba before today? Most people have not. Most people who consider themselves serious students of the First World War have not. And that absence, that specific gap in what Australia has chosen to remember about its own military history, is not an accident. By the end of this story, you will understand not just what happened on that hill in the final hour of daylight on the last day of October, but why it changed the entire shape of the war in the Middle East, and why a country that was given one of the most brilliant victories in its history decided, almost immediately, to look away from it. To understand what happened on that October afternoon, you must first understand the specific kind of failure that made it necessary. Gaza Line existed because the British command had convinced itself of something that was demonstrably not true, and that conviction had cost a great many lives. Ottoman defensive positions stretched from the Mediterranean coast at Gaza, inland, 46 kilometers, to the ancient town of Beersheba in the desert. It was a formidable line, anchored at both ends, defended by experienced troops who had been given months to prepare their ground. British High Command had decided that Gaza, the coastal strongpoint, was the point of maximum vulnerability. This assessment was not merely optimistic. It had hardened into institutional certainty. The logic appeared sound on paper. Gaza sat on the coast where naval gunfire could support the assault. It controlled the main road north into Palestine. It was the obvious target. But obvious targets attract the heaviest defenses, and by the spring of 1917, Gaza had become a fortress. First Battle of Gaza was fought on the 26th and 27th of March, 1917. British and Anzac forces attacked from the south and west. Desert Mounted Corps, under Lieutenant General Sir Philip Chetwode, executed a flanking movement that brought Australian and New Zealand cavalry into Gaza itself. They were inside the city. Ottoman resistance was collapsing. Turkish commanders were preparing to surrender. Then the order came to withdraw. Reasoning given was that darkness was falling and the force might be cut off. The decision was made by commanders who were sitting in headquarters dozens of kilometers from the fighting, reading situation reports that were already hours out of date by the time they arrived. What followed was a decision that would require 2 more failed attempts and 5 more months of stalemate to correct. Mounted troops pulled back. Gaza was evacuated. Ottomans, who had been preparing to surrender, instead reinforced. The city that had been on the verge of falling became impregnable. Second Battle of Gaza opened on the 17th of April, 1917. This time, the British brought everything. Tanks made their first appearance in this theater, lumbering steel boxes that terrified the horses and broke down in the sand. Poison gas was deployed, drifting across no man's land, in clouds that killed indiscriminately. Naval gunfire from offshore bombardment pounded Ottoman positions for days, turning the approaches to Gaza into a moonscape of craters and shattered stone. Attack was launched across open ground against prepared defenses that had been strengthened specifically because the British had revealed their intentions in March. Ottoman machine gunners had clear fields of fire. Artillery had pre-registered every likely avenue of approach. Barbed wire entanglements stretched for kilometers, It failed completely. Over 6,000 casualties in 3 days of fighting. No ground gained. No breakthrough achieved. Nothing to show for the blood, except the confirmation that Gaza could not be taken by frontal assault. General Archibald Murray was quietly removed from command. His replacement was General Sir Edmund Allenby, a man with a very different approach to the problem in front of him. Allenby arrived in late June 1917. He was 56 years old, a cavalryman by training and a bully by reputation. His nickname was the Bull, and it was not a term of endearment. He had been sent to Palestine after a mediocre performance on the Western Front, where his rigid adherence to outdated tactics had cost lives without producing results. But Allenby understood something that Murray had not. He understood that the first step in solving a problem is admitting that your current approach is not working. He moved his headquarters from Cairo to the front. He walked the ground. He spoke to the officers who had fought at Gaza and asked them what they had seen. He listened to the Australians and New Zealanders who had been inside Gaza during the first battle and heard them describe what it felt like to be ordered to abandon a position they had just taken. What he learned was that Gaza line was indeed formidable at Gaza, but the British had been attacking the strongest point of a strong line for 5 months, while ignoring the fact that every defensive line has a weakness, and this one's weakness was 60 kilometers inland, where nobody was looking. Beersheba sat at the eastern end of Ottoman defenses, surrounded by desert, supplied by ancient wells that had watered caravans and armies for thousands of years. It was not heavily fortified because it did not need to be. Ottoman planners had assumed that no army would be foolish enough to cross 60 kilometers of waterless desert to attack it. If you could take Beersheba in a single day with the wells intact, you could water an entire army, turn the Ottoman flank, and roll up Gaza line from the undefended side. If you failed, if the wells were destroyed, or you could not take them before nightfall, your force would die of thirst in the Negev. There was no water between the British start line and those wells. No oases, no springs, no backup supply. Plans were already being drafted when Allenby arrived. Lieutenant General Sir Philip Chetwode had spent weeks studying the problem and had concluded that Beersheba was the key. Allenby adopted the plan, expanded it, and gave it everything he had. The entire offensive would be built around a deception operation so audacious that it bordered on fantasy. 2 men who would execute this plan had nothing in common except competence. Lieutenant General Sir Harry Chauvel commanded Desert Mounted Corps. He was 52 years old, a career cavalry officer from Queensland, who had spent the previous 2 years learning that everything he had been taught about mounted warfare was obsolete in the face of modern firepower. He had commanded at Romani in 1916, where Australian light horse had fought dismounted against a Turkish assault across the Sinai and held. He had commanded at First Gaza, where his horsemen had entered the city and then been ordered to withdraw by superiors who did not trust colonial troops to hold what they had taken. That withdrawal burned in him. It burned because he knew his men had done everything asked of them and more, and they had been pulled back, not because they had failed, but because the men giving the orders did not believe Australians were capable of holding what they had won. He understood that cavalry could no longer charge infantry in open ground and survive. Machine guns and barbed wire had ended that possibility at the Somme and Passchendaele. He also understood that there were specific circumstances where the old rules did not apply, and recognizing those circumstances when they appeared was the difference between brilliance and suicide. Brigadier General William Grant commanded 4th Light Horse Brigade. He was 44 years old, a grazier from Victoria who had served in the Boer War and understood horses the way some men understand machinery. He had joined Light Horse as a private in 1914 and risen to brigade command through a combination of tactical judgment and an absolute refusal to sacrifice men for gestures. His brigade consisted of 3 regiments: 4th, 11th, and 12th Light Horse. They were mounted infantry, not cavalry. They rode to battle and fought on foot. Their rifles were their primary weapons. Bayonets they carried were 18 inches of sharpened steel, designed for close combat in trenches, not the curved sabers of traditional cavalry. They wore bandoliers of ammunition across their chests and carried no lances or pennants or any of the other ceremonial equipment that traditional cavalry hauled into battle. They had been training in the desert for 18 months. They knew heat, thirst, and the specific kind of endurance required when your water runs out, and the nearest well is controlled by an enemy who will kill you before you reach it. They had fought at Romani and at Gaza. They had buried friends in the sand and watched horses die of dehydration. They were not romantic about warfare. They were professionals. Planning to take Beersheba required deception on a scale the British had never attempted in this theater. Ottomans had to believe the main attack was still coming at Gaza. Every visible preparation had to point west toward the coast. Meanwhile, massive forces had to move east across the desert without being detected, concentrate in front of Beersheba, and attack before the defenders realized what was happening. Deception operation began in September. False camps were constructed near Gaza, complete with dummy horses made from canvas and wood that looked real from the air. Radio traffic increased, with operators sending fake messages about troop movements and supply deliveries that were never happening. Offshore naval activity intensified, with warships conducting what appeared to be pre-invasion bombardment rehearsals. A staff officer named Richard Meinertzhagen was sent on patrol near enemy lines, carrying a haversack filled with fabricated battle plans showing a third assault on Gaza scheduled for early November. Haversack was dropped during a staged skirmish, recovered by Ottoman patrols, and sent to Turkish headquarters, where intelligence officers studied it and concluded that the British were indeed planning another assault on Gaza. Whether this ruse actually deceived Ottoman intelligence is debatable. What mattered was that when the real offensive began, the bulk of Ottoman forces remained concentrated at Gaza, and Beersheba was defended by a garrison of approximately 4,000 troops who had not been reinforced. March to Beersheba began on the night of the 30th of October. 4th Light Horse Brigade moved out from Aslush at 2100 hours. Aslush had water. Wells there had sustained the concentration of British forces for the previous week, with thousands of men and animals drinking their fill before moving east into the desert. Between Aslush and Beersheba, there was nothing drinkable for 48 kilometers. Horses had not been watered since the afternoon of the 29th. They would not drink again until they reached Beersheba's wells, or died, trying. This was not tactical oversight. This was the entire operational concept. Attack had to succeed before the horses collapsed from dehydration. There was no margin for delay, no possibility of falling back to regroup and try again the next day. Timeline was absolute. The horses had perhaps 48 hours of life left in them without water. After that, they would start dying. Night march covered 30 kilometers. Column moved in darkness across broken ground, studded with rocks and wadis that could snap a horse's leg if the rider missed a step. No lights, no talking. Only sounds were hooves on stone, and the creak of leather, and the occasional snort from a horse that had caught the scent of something in the wind. Temperature dropped. Men who had been baking in the sun 12 hours earlier were shivering by midnight, their uniforms soaked with sweat that turned cold in the desert night. Horses were already suffering. 60 hours without water in desert heat does specific things to an animal. Mucous membranes dry out. Tongue swells. Eyes become dull and sunken. Breathing becomes labored as the body struggles to regulate temperature without the ability to sweat effectively. Some horses were staggering by the time the column halted before dawn. Troopers dismounted and stood beside their mounts, waiting for enough light to see the ground ahead. Nobody slept. Assault on Beersheba was scheduled to begin at dawn, and 4th Brigade's role was to wait in reserve until the infantry and other mounted units had broken through the outer defenses. Then they would be called forward, or they would not. Either way, those horses needed water soon, or they would start dying. Attack on Beersheba began at 5:30 in the morning, 31st of October. British artillery opened fire on Ottoman positions west and south of the town. Bombardment was methodical, walking shells across the trench lines in a pattern that looked like doctrine, but was missing something crucial. Heaviest guns were firing at the wrong targets. They were pounding positions that had already been identified and mapped, positions that the Ottomans knew were vulnerable, positions that had been reinforced specifically because they were obvious targets. Ottoman defenses at Beersheba had been constructed to resist attack from the west and south, where the terrain favored the attacker and the British had been expected to come. Eastern approaches were less developed. Trenches there were shallower, the wire thinner, the fields of fire less comprehensive. This was not a design flaw. It was rational allocation of limited resources to defend against the most likely threat. What Ismet Bey, the Ottoman commander at Beersheba, could not have anticipated was that an entire corps would cross a waterless desert to attack from the east, or that they would do it with such speed that his scouts would not detect the movement until it was too late to shift his dispositions. Infantry assault went in at first light. 60th Division attacked from the southwest, advancing across open ground in extended lines, with bayonets fixed. 74th Division attacked from the south, moving through terrain that offered little cover and less concealment. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters, purchased with casualties. Trenches were taken one at a time. Ottoman resistance was determined. They were fighting for their own water supply, and men defend water in the desert the way they defend their lives, because in that landscape, the two are identical. Turkish machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. Riflemen held their positions until British infantry were close enough to see their faces. By noon, outer trenches had fallen, but the town itself remained in Ottoman hands. Wells remained intact, but unreachable. Chauvel, watching from a ridge 3 kilometers away, could see the tactical problem resolving into something very specific. Infantry had done their job. They had broken the outer defenses and tied down Ottoman reserves. But they could not take the town before dark, and if the town did not fall before dark, the wells would be demolished overnight, and an entire army would wake up with no water and no way to get any. Tel El Saba dominated the eastern approaches to Beersheba. It was a low hill 1,500 meters northeast of the town, fortified with trenches and machine gun positions that commanded the open ground on 3 sides. As long as Tel El Saba remained in Ottoman hands, no force could approach Beersheba from the east without being shredded by flanking fire. New Zealand Mounted Rifles Brigade was ordered to take it. They attacked on foot in the early afternoon heat, dismounting and advancing in short rushes from one patch of cover to the next. Fighting was close and vicious. Grenades were thrown into trenches, the explosions muffled by sand and bodies. Men fought with bayonets and rifle butts in hand-to-hand combat that left bodies piled in the communication trenches between the main defensive lines. Ottoman defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they were defending their own water supply. They held until they were overrun. By 1500 hours, Tel El Saba had fallen. New Zealanders held the hill, and eastern approaches to Beersheba were finally open. Chauvel had approximately 90 minutes of usable daylight remaining. One formation was available and fresh enough to attack. He sent the order to Grant. Put 4th Brigade straight at it. Grant received the order at 1545 hours. He had 3 regiments under his command. 4th and 12th would lead the charge. 11th would follow in reserve. Standard doctrine for mounted infantry facing prepared defenses was to advance within rifle range, dismount, and attack on foot using fire and maneuver. Every man in the brigade had been trained this way. Every tactical manual they had ever read described this method in exhaustive detail. Grant was about to ignore all of it. His reasoning was clear. Dismounted attack would take time. Every minute spent dismounting, forming skirmish lines, and advancing under fire was another minute closer to darkness. Every minute closer to darkness was another minute the German engineers had to complete their demolition preparations on the wells. If darkness fell before the wells were secured, those engineers would have all night to complete their work, and by morning the wells would be rubble and 60,000 men and 70,000 animals would have no water. Only way to reach those wells before the sun set was to ride straight at them at full gallop and accept whatever casualties the machine guns and rifles imposed on the way in. He called his officers together and gave them the order that would define everything that followed. Men, you are fighting for water. There is no water between this side of Beersheba and Asani. Use your bayonets as swords. I wish you the best of luck. Regiments formed up behind a ridge that blocked them from Ottoman observation. 4th Regiment took position on the right, 12th on the left, 11th behind them in reserve. They were deployed in artillery formation, 5 meters between each horseman to reduce casualties from shrapnel. This was not cavalry formation. Cavalry rode boot to boot, knee to knee, in tight formations designed for shock and intimidation. Artillery formation spread men out to survive bombardment. Grant was expecting his men to be shelled during the approach, and he was right. Horses were exhausted, dehydrated, and skittish. Some were already foundering, their legs trembling with the effort of standing. Troopers tightened girths and checked weapons. Bayonets were drawn and held like sabers, because sabers were what cavalry carried, and these men were about to do what cavalry did. Rifles were slung across their backs, useless for mounted combat, but necessary for the fight that would come after the charge. Every man understood what was about to happen. They were going to ride 4 kilometers across open ground into machine gun fire, and either take those wells or die trying. There was no third option. There was no plan for what to do if the charge failed. If the charge failed, the entire offensive failed, and they would all die of thirst in the desert. Charge began at 16:30 hours. Regiments crested the ridge, and the slope opened below them. Beersheba was suddenly there, a smudge of buildings and dust against the desert, with Ottoman trenches cutting across the open ground between the ridge and the town. Turkish gunners saw them immediately and opened fire with shrapnel. First shells burst overhead, spraying fragments of metal across the formation. Horses screamed and went down, thrashing in the dirt, with legs shattered and bellies torn open. Riders were thrown, hitting the ground hard and rolling to avoid being trampled by the horses behind them. Line closed up and kept moving. Grant's calculation was proving correct in the most brutal way possible. Pace was too fast for the gunners. They could not adjust their range quickly enough to track targets moving at 30 kilometers per hour across broken ground. Shells that should have been landing among the horsemen were bursting behind them, chasing a target that was already out of reach. Artillery crews were trained to hit infantry advancing at walking pace, perhaps 5 kilometers per hour, giving them time to adjust elevation and fuse settings between salvos. They had no procedure for tracking cavalry at full gallop. By the time they corrected their aim, the target had moved. At a mile distant, their 1,000 hooves were stuttering thunder, coming at a rate that frightened a man. They were an awe-inspiring sight, galloping through the red haze of dust and setting sun, knee to knee and horse to horse, the sun glinting on bayonet points that caught the light like 1,000 mirrors. Machine guns and rifle fire roared from the trenches, but 4th Brigade galloped on, Horses crashed and rolled, throwing their riders into the dirt. Men were hit and fell from the saddle without a sound, dead before they hit the ground. Line thinned, but did not break. Gaps opened where men and horses went down, and the formation flowed around them like water around stones. 3 kilometers. 2 kilometers. Turkish riflemen were firing high. They had sighted their weapons for targets at long range, 300 or 400 meters, where they expected dismounted troops to appear. In the chaos and speed of the moment, as hundreds of horsemen bore down on them at a rate they had never seen before, they forgot to adjust their sights. Bullets snapped overhead, cracking through the air 2 or 3 meters above the riders. 1 kilometer. Pace became a berserk gallop, the squadrons in magnificent line, a heart-stopping sight as they plunged up the slope toward the trenches. Horses were maddened now, driven beyond exhaustion by terror and instinct, galloping because they could no longer stop, even if their riders had tried to rein them in. Ottoman infantry saw the bayonets coming, and many froze. They had been trained to fight dismounted infantry. They had been trained to repel attacks by men advancing on foot, at walking pace, stopping to fire and reload, seeking cover behind rocks and in folds in the ground. They had never been trained for this. Some threw grenades, the small bombs arcing through the air and exploding among the horses. Some fired point-blank into the mass of horses and men bearing down on them, working their rifle bolts as fast as their hands could move. It made no difference. 4th Regiment hit the trenches on the right, and the horses jumped. They leaped the front trench and the main trench in 2 bounds, 1,600 pounds of horse and rider, landing among the defenders, with hooves and weight and momentum that crushed men where they stood. Troopers dismounted in the trenches and attacked with bayonets and rifle butts. Fighting was savage and short. Men stabbed and clubbed each other in the narrow confines of the trenches, grunting and cursing and dying in the space of seconds. 12th Regiment struck a section of trench that was unfinished, little more than a shallow ditch without wire or traverses. They did not dismount. They jumped the obstacle and kept galloping down the slope into Beersheba itself, a thundering wave of horsemen pouring into the town, while Ottoman defenders were still trying to understand what had just happened. Trooper Thomas O'Leary, a Queenslander riding with 4th Regiment, raced ahead of his unit into the town and captured 30 Ottoman soldiers single-handed. He cornered them in a courtyard, dismounted with his bayonet fixed, and convinced them through sheer audacity and the fact that he was covered in dust and blood and looked absolutely insane that resistance was pointless. He then assisted in the capture of a field gun whose crew had abandoned it when the charge overran their position, running for their lives as Australian horsemen galloped past them into the streets. For this action, he was awarded the Military Medal. Trooper Albert Cotter, a fast bowler who had played Test cricket for Australia before the war and was famous enough that his name appeared in newspapers, was riding with 12th Regiment. He had requested a transfer from another unit specifically to be part of the charge. He wanted to be there. His older brother had been killed in Belgium 3 weeks earlier at Passchendaele, cut down by machine gun fire in the mud, and Cotter had written home that he intended to make the Turks pay for every Australian death in this war. He was shot through the heart as 12th Regiment galloped into Beersheba, killed instantly by a Turkish rifleman firing from a rooftop. He fell from his horse and was trampled by the men riding behind him. He was 29 years old. Wells were the objective. Everything else was secondary. As 4th and 12th Regiments fought in the trenches and streets, individual troopers began moving toward the town center, where the wells were located. They could hear explosions from deeper in the town, the sharp crack of demolition charges being tested or prepared. A German engineering officer was attempting to destroy the wells. Explosives had been placed at the main wellheads. Fuses had been prepared. Detonators had been connected. All he needed was 10 minutes without interruption to complete the work. He did not get it. Trooper Scotty Bolton, a sheep farmer from New South Wales, who had worked with explosives before the war, followed electrical wires through the chaos of the town, tracking them from building to building like a man following a trail. He found the German officer and his demolition team at one of the main wells, kneeling beside charges that were ready to fire, and captured them at gunpoint before the charges could be detonated. The German officer was furious, screaming in broken English that Bolton had no right to interfere with military operations, as if the rules of war gave him some kind of protected status to destroy the only water source in 60 kilometers. Bolton told him to shut up, or he would shoot him where he knelt. Wells were intact. An entire army had water. By 1800 hours, Beersheba was in British hands. Ottoman resistance had collapsed. Survivors were surrendering in groups, emerging from buildings with their hands raised, relieved that the fighting was over, and they were still alive. 4th Light Horse Brigade had lost 31 men killed and 36 wounded. 140 horses were dead or had to be destroyed, most of them shot where they lay because their injuries were too severe to treat. These were remarkably light casualties for a frontal assault across open ground against prepared defenses. Similar attacks on the Western Front had cost thousands of lives for gains measured in hundreds of meters. Explanation became clear when captured Ottoman and German officers were interrogated after the battle. Even when they saw the mounted troops cresting the ridge 4 kilometers away, they never believed those men would be insane enough to charge directly at infantry redoubts, protected by machine guns and artillery, without dismounting. Assumption that the Australians would follow doctrine gave Grant the 15 seconds he needed for the charge to close the distance before effective fire could be concentrated on the formation. Ottoman machine gunners had hesitated, waiting for the Australians to dismount because that was what mounted infantry did. By the time they realized the Australians were not going to dismount, by the time they understood that these men were going to ride straight at them like cavalry from a previous century, it was too late. Doctrine saved the Australians by blinding the men trying to kill them. Immediate aftermath of the charge was water. Horses that had been ridden to the edge of collapse crowded around the wells, pushing and fighting for access, biting and kicking each other in their desperation to drink. Troopers filled canteens and drank until they were sick, vomiting, and then drinking again because their bodies were so dehydrated they could not process the sudden influx of water. Infantry divisions that had been fighting since dawn began moving into Beersheba to resupply. Long columns of exhausted men trudging through the streets, past dead horses and dead Turks. Ottoman prisoners were rounded up and moved to holding areas under guard. German demolition teams were secured, and their explosives carefully removed from the wells they had been seconds away from destroying, each charge dismantled and rendered safe by British engineers who understood exactly how close they had come to disaster. Chauvel established his headquarters in the town and began planning the exploitation. Beersheba was not the objective. Beersheba was the key that unlocked the objective. With the eastern anchor of the Ottoman line broken and water secured for the advancing force, the entire Gaza-Beersheba defensive line could now be rolled up from the flank. Plan had worked exactly as designed. The question now was whether Allenby could exploit the breakthrough before the Ottomans recovered. Strategic consequences unfolded over the next 6 weeks. Ottoman 7th and 8th armies, which had held Gaza line for 8 months, began a fighting withdrawal north toward Jerusalem. They were not routed, they were not broken, but they were forced to abandon prepared positions and fight a mobile defensive campaign for which they had inadequate logistics and no strategic reserve. Allenby pursued. He pushed his forces north, maintaining contact with the retreating Ottomans and preventing them from establishing new defensive lines. Gaza fell on the 7th of November, 1 week after Beersheba. The fortress that had resisted 2 major assaults and cost 6,000 British casualties was abandoned without a fight once its flank was turned. Junction Station, the critical rail link that supplied Ottoman forces in southern Palestine, fell on the 14th of November. By early December, British forces were approaching Jerusalem from the west and south, converging on the Holy City from multiple directions. City surrendered on the 9th of December, 1917. Allenby entered on foot through the Jaffa Gate out of respect for the Holy City, refusing to ride in as a conqueror. British War Cabinet, desperate for good news after 3 years of stalemate on the Western Front, celebrated the capture of Jerusalem as a propaganda victory of the First Order. Prime Minister David Lloyd George had demanded Jerusalem as a Christmas present for the British people. Allenby delivered it with 2 weeks to spare. Charge at Beersheba made that possible. Without the wells, there would have been no water for the pursuit. Without the pursuit, the Ottomans would have established a new defensive line somewhere between Beersheba and Jerusalem, and the campaign would have stalled. Jerusalem would have remained in Ottoman hands indefinitely. Entire strategic picture in the Middle East turned on whether 800 horsemen could cross 4 kilometers of open ground in the final hour of daylight and take a town whose wells were rigged to be destroyed. They did. War in Palestine was effectively decided in that 90-minute window between 1630 and 1800 hours on the 31st of October, 1917. Charge became famous almost immediately, but the fame was built on a foundation that was partially false. Iconic photograph that appeared in newspapers around the world, showing massed horsemen galloping across the desert with bayonets raised and dust clouds billowing behind them, was almost certainly not taken at Beersheba. Analysis of the image shows details inconsistent with the actual terrain and tactical formation used in the charge. Photograph was likely taken during training exercises months earlier and retroactively labeled as Beersheba because it looked the way people wanted the charge to look. It had everything a good propaganda photograph needed: drama, action, heroism, and a clear narrative of brave men doing impossible things. Truth was more complicated and less photogenic. Ion Idris, a trooper who had watched the charge from a distance with 5th Light Horse Regiment, positioned on a flank, published his account in 1932 in a book titled The Desert Column. His description of the charge, written 15 years after the event, became the canonical version repeated in histories and memorials. At a mile distant, their 1,000 hooves were stuttering thunder, knee to knee and horse to horse, the sun glinting on bayonet points. It is stirring prose. It is also a passage that could not have been observed from Idries's position, given the terrain and the dust, written long after the fact, when the mystique of Beersheba had already solidified into legend and memory had been reshaped by subsequent retellings. Truth behind the charge is less romantic and more interesting. 4th Light Horse Brigade succeeded because of combined arms coordination that involved infantry, artillery, and air reconnaissance working together to create the conditions that made the charge possible. British 60th and 74th Divisions fought all day to break the outer Ottoman defenses and tie down the enemy reserves, preventing Turkish commanders from shifting troops to meet the threat from the east. New Zealand mounted rifles took Tel El Saba in brutal close combat that opened the eastern approaches and eliminated the flanking threat that would have massacred 4th Brigade during its approach. British artillery suppressed the Ottoman machine guns on Hill 1180 that could have swept the open ground with enfilading fire. Royal Flying Corps aircraft provided reconnaissance that confirmed the Ottoman defenders had not adjusted their positions to meet an attack from the east, giving Chauvel the intelligence he needed to commit to the plan. None of this diminishes what Grant's brigade accomplished. It contextualizes it. 800 men on horseback charged across open ground and won. But they won because an entire corps created the specific tactical situation where such a charge could succeed. Strip away the combined arms framework, and the charge becomes suicide. Include it, and the charge becomes brilliant exploitation of a fleeting opportunity created by the coordinated efforts of thousands of men. Grant was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership during the charge. Chauvel was knighted and eventually promoted to full general, the first Australian to reach that rank. Allenby received a peerage and became Viscount Allenby of Megiddo, named for another biblical battlefield where he had won another victory. Individual troopers who rode into Beersheba received nothing immediate beyond survival and the knowledge that they had done something extraordinary. Awards would come later, much later, and when they came, they would be inadequate recognition for men who had risked everything on a gamble that should not have worked. Horses did not come home. Of the 136,000 horses that served with Australian forces during the First World War, exactly one returned to Australia. His name was Sandy, and he belonged to Major General William Bridges, who had been killed at Gallipoli. Sandy was brought home as a memorial, paraded through the streets, and eventually died of natural causes in 1949. The rest were killed, sold, or abandoned. Quarantine regulations prohibited their return. Australian authorities cited disease concerns, specifically the risk of introducing glanders and other equine diseases to a continent that had been free of them. Cost was also a factor. Shipping 136,000 horses back to Australia would have required hundreds of voyages and millions of pounds at a time when the government was desperate to demobilize and cut spending. After the armistice, the decision was made to dispose of the horses in theater. Some were sold to Egyptian buyers, who used them as draft animals in cities and on farms. Some were transferred to British units, who were remaining in the Middle East as occupation forces. Thousands were shot. Troopers were not consulted about this decision. They were simply ordered to hand over their mounts, and many refused until ordered again by officers who hated giving the order as much as the men hated receiving it. Horses that survived 4 years of desert warfare, that had charged at Beersheba and fought at Gaza and carried their riders through campaigns across Sinai and Palestine, were led away to be sold as draft animals or killed for dog meat. Their manes were shorn before they were shot because the hair had commercial value and could be sold to manufacturers who used it for upholstery stuffing. This detail appears in multiple accounts from men who were there, and it is almost unbearable to read. Men who had trusted those horses with their lives, who had watered them from their own canteens when water was scarce, who had ridden them into machine gun fire because the mission demanded it, were not permitted to save them. Some troopers shot their own horses rather than let strangers do it. Some walked away and let others handle it because they could not bear to watch. Some wept openly and were not ashamed of it. The horses had no understanding of what was happening. They trusted the men who led them away. That trust was repaid with a bullet. Memory of Beersheba did not survive in Australia the way Gallipoli did. Gallipoli became the founding myth of Australian military identity, the story told in schools and memorialized in stone across the country, the subject of books and films and annual commemorations. Beersheba became a footnote. Charge was acknowledged, certainly. It appeared in official histories and regimental records. Memorials were eventually built. But it never entered the national consciousness the way the landing at Anzac Cove did, never became part of the story Australians told themselves about who they were and what they valued. There are reasons for this. Gallipoli was a disaster that revealed courage in defeat. Beersheba was a victory that revealed tactical competence in execution. Nations build myths around the former more easily than the latter. Suffering is more photogenic than success. The digger at Gallipoli, clinging to a cliff face under Turkish fire, dying for a cause that was already lost, became a symbol of endurance against impossible odds. The light horsemen at Beersheba, executing a brilliantly planned operation that succeeded beyond all reasonable expectation, became a symbol of professional military skill applied at the right moment. One story is about character. Other is about competence. Australia chose to remember the character. There is also the uncomfortable question of what Beersheba represented in the larger context of the war. Palestine campaign was a sideshow. It tied down Ottoman forces and secured British interests in the Middle East, protecting the Suez Canal and ensuring access to oil fields that were becoming strategically critical. But it did not shorten the war by a single day. The war would be decided on the Western Front, in the trenches of France and Belgium, where millions of men were dying in battles that made Beersheba look like a skirmish. Western Front was where the real war was being waged, where the outcome would be determined, where history was being written in blood and mud. Australians died at Passchendaele in the Somme in numbers that dwarfed the casualties at Beersheba. 60,000 Australian casualties on the Western Front in 1917 alone. 31 dead at Beersheba was a rounding error in that accounting. Light Horse fought brilliantly in a theater that strategically did not matter as much as the trenches in France and Belgium, where Australian infantry was being ground to pieces in battles that achieved nothing. Chauvel understood this. His family reported after his death that he was deeply uncomfortable with the mythology that grew around the charge, and that he would have said, if asked directly, that it was simply a military decision made at a particular time under specific circumstances that happened to work out. He did not view it as the defining moment of his career. He viewed it as one tactical problem among many that he had solved competently using the resources available to him. Fact that it looked dramatic was incidental to whether it was necessary. Grant felt similarly. He gave interviews after the war in which he emphasized the role of the infantry and artillery in creating the conditions for the charge. He resisted efforts to portray 4th Brigade as lone heroes, charging into battle without support. He insisted on explaining the combined arms reality because he understood that successful operations are built on coordination between different elements, not on individual acts of heroism divorced from context. Both men were career soldiers who understood that warfare is fundamentally about logistics, coordination, and timing, not about bravery or dash or any of the other qualities that make good stories. They were trying to ensure that the historical record reflected what actually happened, rather than what made a better story for the newspapers. Tactical lessons from Beersheba were absorbed into military doctrine worldwide, though rarely credited to the battle that demonstrated them. Use of mounted infantry in exploitation roles after breakthroughs became standard in mobile warfare theory developed between the wars. Emphasis on speed and shock action to close distance before defensive fire could be concentrated influenced armored doctrine in the Second World War, when tanks replaced horses, but the principle remained the same. Requirement for combined arms integration to create conditions for successful attacks became foundational to modern maneuver warfare, practiced by every professional military on Earth. These ideas did not originate at Beersheba, but Beersheba proved them in combat under conditions that could not be replicated in peacetime exercises. Military establishments that studied the Palestine campaign understood what had been demonstrated. They incorporated those lessons into training manuals and planning documents. They taught them at staff colleges. They built them into doctrine. They did not make public spectacles of the source material because the source material involved colonial troops in a secondary theater, and institutional memory has always been selective about which successes it chooses to celebrate and which it quietly absorbs without acknowledgement. Memorial at Beersheba was erected decades after the battle. It stands on the ridge where 4th Light Horse Brigade formed up before the charge, a simple stone monument overlooking the ground they crossed. Inscription lists the 31 men killed, their names carved into stone, so they will not be forgotten. Tibby Cotter's name is there. Thomas O'Leary's is not, because he survived the war and lived to old age in Queensland, dying in his bed, surrounded by family who had heard his stories so many times they could recite them from memory. Memorial faces toward the town across the ground. The regiments crossed at full gallop in the final hour of that October afternoon. Visitors stand at the monument and look down the slope and try to imagine what it must have felt like to crest that ridge and see the Ottoman trenches 4 kilometers away, and the machine guns waiting, and know there was no turning back, that the only way was forward into the fire. Imagination fails. Some things cannot be adequately reconstructed from safety. You can stand on the ground and read the accounts and study the maps, but you cannot know what it felt like to be there, to feel the horse beneath you gathering itself for the gallop, to hear the shells bursting overhead, to see the man beside you fall and know that you might be next and ride forward anyway, because the mission demanded it, and your mates were counting on you. Charge at Beersheba was the last great cavalry charge in military history. Not the last cavalry charge, but the last one that succeeded against modern defenses on a scale that changed the outcome of a campaign. There would be other mounted actions in other wars. Polish cavalry would charge German tanks in 1939 in a desperate attempt to slow the invasion. Soviet cavalry would conduct raids behind German lines in 1941 and 42. But none would combine the tactical audacity, the strategic consequences, and the sheer improbability of 800 men on horseback defeating an entrenched, combined arms defense through speed and shock. Age of Cavalry ended at Beersheba not with failure, but with a success so complete and so unrepeatable that it proved the exception rather than invalidating the rule. Mounted troops could no longer dominate modern battlefields the way they had dominated battlefields for thousands of years. They could, under very specific and very rare circumstances, exploit fleeting opportunities that mechanized forces were not yet mobile enough to seize and infantry were too slow to reach. Beersheba was that circumstance. It would not come again. Tanks and armored vehicles would replace horses within a generation, offering the same mobility and shock effect without the vulnerability to machine gun fire that made cavalry obsolete. But on the 31st of October, 1917, for 90 minutes in the dying light of a desert afternoon, 800 Australians proved that the age of cavalry was not quite over. Now you know. Tell me in the comments whether you had heard of the Charge of Beersheba before today, because the men in that memorial and the horses that never came home deserve at minimum that someone is still paying attention to what they accomplished when doctrine said cavalry was obsolete, and 800 Australians proved that obsolete weapons in the right hands at the right moment can still change the world.